Yes, the truth is getting out. Elvis is alive.
After 50 years, the sealed military discharge papers of Elvis Presley were finally opened. Many expected a normal document from his time in the army, but something strange appeared. One important detail had been deliberately removed before the file was revealed. Why would anyone hide a single piece of information for so long? What secret could still matter today? Join us as we uncover the truth, the blank line in Elvis Presley's secret file. There are people who walk into a room and the air changes. Not because they demand it, not because they try, but because something in them, something warm and unguarded, makes everyone around them feel seen. Elvis Presley was that kind of person, long before the rhinestone suits and the sold-out arenas, before the world decided he belonged to them. Elvis was a boy from Tupelo, Mississippi, who said, "Yes, ma'am," and meant it. People who met him in his early years often said the same thing. He was surprisingly shy. He had a habit of looking down when he laughed, as though he was embarrassed by his own joy. He called older women Mom, even when he was already famous. He tipped generously, remembered names, and had a tenderness about him that his music carried like a fingerprint. He was also, in the truest sense, a man of his word. So, when the United States Army came calling in 1958, at the very peak of his early fame, when every concert sold out before the posters dried, Elvis Presley did not run. He did not hire lawyers to find a loophole. He did not use his celebrity to arrange a comfortable assignment far from real duty. He showed up. He cut his hair. He packed his bag. He stood in line like every other young man, and he served. For 2 years he trained, slept in the same barracks as ordinary soldiers, and worked like someone who had something to prove, not to the world, but to himself. Fellow servicemen later described him as hard-working and easy to be around, someone who didn't make a fuss about who he was. He just wanted to be one of the guys, one of them recalled years later. And from everything visible, he succeeded. That chapter of his life seems simple enough. A celebrity who served his country with humility. A good story, neatly finished. But some stories do not finish. Deep inside a government records facility, far from any stage or spotlight, a folder had been sitting untouched for decades. The name on the label was unmistakable: Elvis Presley. Archivists had walked past it many times over the years. Some paused. Some looked twice at the name, felt a small flutter of recognition, and moved on. The file was sealed. Not for a year, not for 10 years, but for 50. That was the instruction. That was the rule. What struck the few people who noticed it was not just the name. It was the length of the restriction. Most military discharge records become public within a reasonable number of years. There is nothing particularly sensitive about knowing when a soldier was released, what rank he held, or what unit he served in. These are ordinary details, bureaucratic, boring even. 50 years is not ordinary. 50 years is the kind of seal placed on things that someone, somewhere, decided the public was not yet ready to read. The building around the file changed over the decades. Staff retired and were replaced. Hallways were repainted. Filing systems were updated, but the envelope sat exactly where it had been placed, patient as a held breath, waiting for a date that had been written on a calendar long before most of the current archivists were born. Then, at last, that date arrived. The morning the file was scheduled to be opened was unremarkable from the outside. No announcement had been made. There were no cameras, no journalists waiting at the door. Just a room, a table, a folder. The envelope was brought out carefully. It was old. The paper had taken on that slightly golden tone that comes with decades of stillness. But it had been well preserved. The name on the front was still sharp and clear. Someone set it down on the large wooden table. For a moment, no one spoke. Then they opened it. Inside were the discharge papers, typed neatly in the formal language of military administration. Dates, ranks, service assignments. The standard structure of a life briefly handed over to the government and then returned. At first glance, everything looked exactly as it should. And then someone leaned in closer. One section of the document looked wrong. Not faded. Paper fades naturally, and this was not that. Not damaged, there was no tear, no water stain, no mark of accident or age. A section had been removed, deliberately, cleanly, before the document had ever been sealed. The space where words should have appeared was simply blank, a gap in the official record where something had once been and was no longer. Someone, at some point before this file was locked away for half a century, had made sure that one particular piece of information would not survive the wait. The researchers sat with that silence for a moment, because this changed things. A military discharge record is not a personal diary, it is a legal document. Altering it is not a small matter. And whoever had altered this one had done it carefully, deliberately, and then buried the result beneath 50 years of restricted access. The question was no longer simply, what did Elvis Presley's military records say? The question had become, who decided that part of it should never be read, and why? Elvis Presley passed away in 1977. He never spoke publicly about anything unusual from his time in the Army. By the end of his life, he was exhausted, unwell, and surrounded by people who protected him from almost everything. But somewhere in those 2 years of military service, in the late 1950s, something had happened, or been noticed, or been done, that someone in an official position had quietly decided to erase. The man who said, "Yes, ma'am," and meant it. The man who showed up when he could have found a way out. The man whose voice made strangers cry in languages he did not speak. That man had a blank line where his full story should have been, and the blank line was still waiting to be explained. The letter that changed everything. There is a particular kind of strength that does not announce itself. It does not walk into a room demanding to be noticed. It does not raise its voice to prove a point. It simply shows up, quietly, consistently, without asking for applause. Elvis Presley had that kind of strength. Beneath the curled lip and the swiveling hips, beneath all the electricity that made stadiums shake, there was a boy who had grown up with very little and never quite forgot it. People who knew him personally, not fans watching from the back row, but people who sat with him at a table and talked, often came away surprised. He was gentler than they expected, more thoughtful. He asked questions and actually waited for the answers. He remembered the names of people others would have forgotten by the next morning. He was, by most accounts, genuinely kind. And it was that kindness, that deep, almost old-fashioned sense of decency, that made what happened in 1958 so remarkable. By the late 1950s, Elvis Presley was not simply famous. He was something larger than fame. His music poured out of radios in every state. Concert venues sold out before the dates were even confirmed. Teenage girls fainted at the sight of him. Grown men who disapproved of his dancing still found themselves humming his songs. He was, without question, one of the most recognizable human beings on the planet. And then a letter arrived. It was not a fan letter. It was not a contract offer or a telegram from a film studio. It was a draft notice from the United States Army, printed in the plain, no argument language of the government, informing Elvis Aaron Presley that his country required his service. The entertainment industry held its breath. Everyone knew what usually happened next. Celebrities with enough money and enough lawyers could almost always find a way around military service, a convenient medical condition, a critical civilian role, some quiet arrangement that kept the famous name safely off the front lines and out of the barracks. Nobody would have been shocked if Elvis had done the same. He didn't. He folded the letter, set it down, and began to prepare. "It's the duty I owe my country," he said simply. And that was that. What followed was something that few people in his position had ever chosen. When Elvis Presley walked into military training, he walked in as a private, not as a special case, not as a morale-boosting celebrity on a carefully managed tour. He wore the same uniform as the man beside him, woke at the same hour, ate the same food, and completed the same physical drills under the same demanding conditions. His fellow soldiers did not quite know what to make of him at first. How do you treat someone like that normally? How do you bunk beside a man whose face is on posters across the country and pretend it is an ordinary Tuesday? But Elvis made it easier than it should have been. He did not talk about his record sales. He did not ask for exceptions. When someone made a joke at his expense, he laughed. When the work was hard, he did the work. Over time, the superstar faded into the background, and what remained was simply a young soldier, earnest, diligent, and surprisingly easy to be around. His assignment eventually took him to Germany, and it was there that the most meaningful transformation happened away from any audience. The world he had known before, the recording studios, the tour buses, the rooms full of screaming people, had been replaced by something almost monastic in comparison. Early mornings, precise schedules, responsibilities that did not bend around his feelings or his comfort. He rose to it. More than that, he grew inside it. The discipline that the army imposed on him from the outside began to settle somewhere deeper. He formed genuine friendships, the kind that form between people who share difficulty rather than celebration. He learned to be still. He learned that patience was not weakness, and he carried those lessons back with him when the time finally came to go home. For the public, the story seemed to end there. Elvis Presley served. Elvis Presley returned. The nation's favorite son had done his duty and come back to reclaim his crown. But that was not the whole story. When his discharge papers were prepared in the final days of his service, they should have contained a complete record. Every relevant detail from his years in uniform, carefully typed and officially stamped. And in most places, they did. But one section was empty. Not damaged, not obscured by age or accident. Empty. Deliberately, precisely, intentionally blank. Someone had removed a specific piece of information before the file was sealed, and then that file had been locked away for 50 years. Long enough, perhaps, for the people who knew what had been removed to no longer be in any position to explain it. What had Elvis's final military evaluation said? What detail had been considered too delicate, too complicated, or too dangerous to leave in a document that would one day be read by strangers? He left the army with honor. That part was clear. He was not discharged under difficult circumstances. No scandal followed him home. He stepped back onto American soil, returned to his music, and within months had reclaimed his place at the center of the world's attention. And yet, something from those years had been quietly cut away. The man who showed up when others would have found an excuse. The man who stood in line with everyone else and asked for nothing special. The man who was, by every account of those who served beside him, decent to the core. That man had a gap in his official record, and whoever put it there made very sure it would stay hidden for a very long time. The line that someone erased before anyone could read it. He had a way of making people feel like the most important person in the room. Not through grand gestures or rehearsed charm. Elvis Presley was never that calculated. It was something quieter than that. A genuine curiosity about the people around him, a habit of leaning in when someone spoke, as though whatever they were saying was worth his full attention. Friends described a man who could move from laughter to sincerity in a single breath, who cried at sad movies and wasn't embarrassed about it, who carried his faith in his back pocket like a worn letter he'd read 100 times and still found comfort in. He was tender in a way that surprised people, because from the outside, Elvis looked like thunder. The voice, the movement, the sheer force of his presence on a stage, none of it suggested softness. But the people who sat with him in quiet moments, away from the screaming crowds and the bright lights, often said the same thing. He was sweeter than you expected, more uncertain, more real. That realness is what makes what happened to his military record feel so strange, so personal, so deeply unfair. By the time historians finally broke the seal on his discharge papers, decades had already passed. The file had sat in a government records facility for 50 years, untouched, restricted, and largely forgotten by everyone except the occasional archivist who paused at the famous name and then moved on. When the folder was finally opened and the papers were laid flat on a table, the researchers expected routine. Military discharge documents are, by their nature, dry reading. Dates, ranks, units, the bureaucratic summary of a life briefly given to the government and then handed back. But what they found inside was not routine. They began with the basics, studying the typeface, the spacing, the structure of the page. These things matter when you are trying to understand a document. The way a page is laid out tells you what it was supposed to contain. And this page had a problem. There was a section near the bottom where, by all standard formatting, a remark should have appeared. This was not an unusual feature. Military discharge forms routinely included a line of evaluation, a note about the soldier's conduct, their performance, something to officially close the chapter of their service. In this document, that section was blank, not partially filled, not vague or generalized. Blank. The first instinct is always to wonder if time is the explanation. Paper's yellow, ink fades, documents get damaged in storage, in transit, in the slow, indifferent passage of years. But the experts ruled that out quickly. The rest of the document was intact. The ink throughout was consistent. There were no signs of water damage, no torn edges, no evidence of deterioration that might explain a missing passage. The blank was not the result of age. It was the result of a decision. Someone with the authority to touch an official government record before it was sealed had removed that line. They had done it deliberately, carefully, and early enough that the document could be finalized and filed without the absence appearing accidental. This was not a mistake. This was a choice. And choices like that, in documents like this, do not happen without approval from somewhere above. That realization changed the texture of the entire discovery. Because if the removal had been approved at a high level, then whatever had been written in that space was not trivial. People in positions of authority do not alter official military records to protect information that doesn't matter. They do not seal files for 50 years to hide something harmless. The blank line was not nothing. It was something specific, something deliberate, and something that someone had decided the public should not read. As the discovery moved through historical circles, the theories came carefully and cautiously, the way serious theories do. Some researchers suggested the missing detail might have been personal, something about Elvis's health, his mental state, or a private matter that military officials felt had no business being part of a permanent record. That would have been unusual, but not unheard of. There were precedents for protecting soldiers from the permanent weight of documented vulnerability. Others thought differently. They pointed to the level of restriction. 50 years was a long time, far longer than personal matters typically required, and wondered whether the missing line had less to do with Elvis's private life and more to do with something he had seen or done or been asked to do during his time in Germany. Special assignments were not uncommon during that period. The late 1950s were complicated years, internationally speaking, and military intelligence moved through unusual channels. A famous face could open doors that ordinary soldiers could not. A man everyone recognized could also, paradoxically, move through certain spaces without anyone thinking to ask too many questions. Was Elvis Presley simply a soldier? Or had he, at some point during those 2 years, been something else as well? Nobody could say. And that was precisely the problem. What made the silence so striking was not the blank line itself. Blank lines exist in documents for all kinds of reasons. What made it striking was the 50 years. Half a century of restriction. Half a century during which Elvis became a legend, then passed away too young, then became something even larger than a legend. An icon, a myth, a name that meant different things to different people all over the world. During all of that time, the file sat closed. And while fans mourned him and celebrated him and debated him, the altered document waited quietly in the dark, keeping it secret with perfect patience. The man who had served without complaint, who had stood in line and asked for nothing and earned the genuine respect of the soldiers beside him. That man had a piece of his story removed before the story was even finished being written, and whoever removed it made absolutely certain that the world would wait a very long time before it had the chance to ask why. The mystery that outlived the man. Some people leave a mark on the world through ambition, through calculation, through the careful construction of a legacy they can see and measure and point to. Elvis Presley was not that kind of person. The mark he left was almost accidental in its depth, as though he simply lived as openly and as honestly as he knew how, and the world, recognizing something rare, decided to hold on to him forever. People who spent time with him in ordinary moments, not at concerts or film sets, but in the in-between spaces of daily life, described someone who seemed genuinely unaware of how extraordinary he was. He would sit at a piano late at night and play gospel music for hours, not for an audience, but because it settled something inside him. He gave things away impulsively, cars, jewelry, money, not to impress anyone, but because someone nearby seemed to need something and he happened to have it. He once said that he never wanted to be a burden to anybody. For a man who carried the weight of an entire generation's dreams on his shoulders, that was a heartbreaking thing to admit. He was, underneath all of it, a profoundly humble person. And that humility, that unpolished, genuine, almost old-fashioned decency, is what makes the story of his military record so quietly devastating. Because when you understand who he was as a human being, the idea that someone reached into his official history and quietly removed a piece of it feels like more than a bureaucratic decision. It feels like a theft. The discharge papers, when they were finally opened after 50 years of careful silence, told most of their story without hesitation. The dates were clear. The rank was recorded. The formal language of military administration moved through the pages in its usual straight lines, accounting for 2 years of a young man's life in the measured vocabulary of service and duty. But then there was the blank. Historians who studied the document described the experience of finding it as surprisingly unsettling. Not because a missing line is, on its own, a dramatic thing. Missing lines happen. Documents are imperfect. Bureaucracies make errors. But this was not an error. The rest of the document was in excellent condition. The ink had held. The paper, though aged to a soft gold, had been well preserved. Nothing else was missing. Nothing else was damaged. The blank space sat in exactly the position where an evaluative remark was supposed to appear. The kind of final note that military records routinely included to close a soldier's chapter with some official summary of their conduct in service. That space was empty. And it had been empty since before the file was sealed. Experts who examined the document were careful and precise in their conclusion. The detail had been removed intentionally before finalization by someone with the authority to alter an official record. This was not the work of time. This was the work of a decision. Somewhere in the chain of command, a person had looked at whatever was written in that space, made a judgment, and ensured that those words would not survive. Then the file was sealed for 50 years. The question of why something is hidden is almost always more interesting than the thing itself. If the missing detail had simply been included, it might have been read once by a researcher, noted briefly, and then absorbed into the vast archive of historical minutiae that surrounds famous lives. Most details are like that. They exist, they are recorded, and they sit quietly in their proper place without causing any particular disturbance. But the act of removing it, deliberately, officially, and for 50 years, transformed that detail into something far more powerful than it might ever have been on its own. The blank space became louder than words. It drew the eye. It demanded explanation. It sat in the middle of an official document like a held breath, insisting on being noticed precisely because someone had worked so hard to make it invisible. Historians approach the mystery with the careful, measured language of their profession. Some suggested the removed detail may have been personal in nature, something connected to Elvis's health or private circumstances during that period, the kind of information that military officials occasionally chose to protect rather than preserve in a public record. This was not without precedent. Soldiers were sometimes shielded from the permanent documentation of difficult moments, particularly when those moments were considered unlikely to affect the broader historical record. Others looked at the length of the restriction and found that explanation insufficient. 50 years is a long time to protect a personal detail. Personal matters, medical records, private correspondence, sensitive but ultimately ordinary human information, rarely required half a century of sealed silence. The duration of the restriction suggested something with a longer reach, something that might still have been relevant, still have been sensitive, years and decades after Elvis Presley himself had left the world. And so, the second theory moved carefully forward, that the missing line had less to do with Elvis's personal life and more to do with what he had been asked to do, or had been involved in, or had witnessed during his time stationed in Germany in the late 1950s. This was a complicated period in history. The Cold War was not an abstraction, it was a daily operational reality for military personnel across Europe. Intelligence moved through unusual channels. Information was currency, and a man with Elvis Presley's face, recognized instantly by almost everyone, welcomed into rooms that ordinary soldiers could not enter, capable of attracting and disarming attention wherever he went, was not necessarily just a private working his way through a standard assignment. What role, if any, had he actually played? The blank line offered no answer. It only deepened the question. There is something particularly poignant about the fact that Elvis Presley never spoke publicly about any of this. By the time the sealed file might have become a subject of open conversation, he was already gone. He passed away in 1977, at 42, leaving behind a silence of his own, a long list of things he had never quite gotten around to saying. Whether he knew about the missing line is impossible to determine, Whether he knew why it had been removed is equally unknown. What is known is that he came home from his military service quietly changed. The discipline had settled into him. The friendships he had formed during those years were real ones, the kind built from shared difficulty rather than shared success, and he kept some of them for the rest of his life. He spoke of his time in uniform without bitterness and without drama, simply as something he had done, something that had shaped him, something that was finished. He moved forward, as he always did, but the document he left behind in a government archive told a slightly different story. Not a scandalous one, not necessarily a dark one, but an incomplete one. A story with a page missing, or more precisely, with a single line removed from a single page. One deliberate absence in an otherwise carefully maintained record. That absence outlasted him. Today, the open discharge papers exist as something more than a historical document. They exist as a reminder that even the most thoroughly examined lives contain spaces that resist explanation. Elvis Presley has been studied with extraordinary thoroughness. His music has been analyzed, his performances preserved, his personal life turned over and examined from every available angle. And still, in an official government record, there is a blank. A sealed envelope that waited 50 years. A decision made in a quiet office by a person whose name we do not know to remove one line before the file was closed. A careful, deliberate act of erasure that may have seemed, at the moment, like a small administrative choice. It did not stay small. Because the truth about blank spaces is that they do not stay quiet. They ask questions in silence. They suggest possibilities. They remind us that history is never quite as finished as it appears. That the stories we think we know completely almost never are. And that sometimes the most important sentence in a document is the one that is no longer there. What did those missing words say? Why were they considered worth hiding for about 50 years? The man who inspired them was kind, decent, and real, in a way that fame rarely allows. He deserved a complete record. He did not get one, and the blank space he left behind is still waiting, after all this time, for someone to finally fill it in.